Hey, deserving listeners, we have a special guest on the podcast today, Dr. Jordan Allen, who is an associate professor at Utah Valley University, which is near Provo. She has expertise in a lot of areas, including communication. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Jordan Allen.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan. Oh.
Yeah, I was at the end of one of my episodes of Sister Wives Reaction. I said, hey, if you're an expert on something, I always like to talk with experts and learn. And it's gratifying to know that legit scientists and professors and clinicians are watching my stupid little reaction videos to Sister Wives. So at the very least, you're justifying my existence.
Oh, good.
You're currently writing a textbook on communication, and you also wrote that you are passionate about the ongoing pervasive myths in our culture around communication that can cause suffering. So what are some myths of communication that you'd like to dispel?
One of the biggest that I am writing about right now is that we sender-receiver model of communication is always the way that we've talked about communication. That there's a person that sends a message and then a person that receives a message. And really that model came from like broadcasting or communications with the S kind of information. So miscommunication wasn't used until like the 1930s. Sender-receiver wasn't used until the 1930s into the 1950s. And so there's a lot of things that come along with this model, like attunement, also like getting a tune or tune in. What's a really good one? Getting on the same wavelength as somebody. All of these come with like assumptions about how we should be communicating.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't think about that, but I love to learn these kinds of things because it really helps us to understand the reductions that have been given to us regarding complex human processes. My mentor, who died a couple years ago, Phil Cushman, he would talk often about how our current technology affects how we see the self, the very thing that defines who we are and what we are and our place in the universe. We'll use all these terms now that reflect our current age, like having downloaded information, right?
Yes.
That kind of stuff. But it makes sense that with communication, that when the telegraph and the phone and radio communication started to become the trending topic, if you will, that we would reduce communication to that model where you have a sent message and then you have a receiver. You just imagine the telegraph, beep, 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 beep,
No,
beep.
exactly, yeah.
And then there's attunement, which I hadn't thought about. That makes total sense. You'd be tuning in on the right frequency for wireless. And it's useful as a metaphor, but if we only see it through that lens, then it can limit us and might even be used perniciously by capitalists to control us or powerful people, politicians, as a way of controlling the narrative, right? And at the very least, it gets us away from the breadth of human experience when it comes to communication. So what is a more nuanced way of thinking about communication, or a more nuanced metaphor?
Communication as a field, like you said, is so broad. So we have social scientists who look more like me, and I would assume, hopefully not presumptuous, like you, that looks very similar to psychology. And actually, my undergraduate degree is in psychology with an emphasis in like neuropsychology. And then on the other end, I have a twin sister who's also a professor of communication, but she does rhetoric and public communication. And then everything in between, PR, journalism, media studies, everything in between. And so one of the unique things to come from our field, because we've had to deal with all these diverse areas of research and interest, is the constitutive model of communication. And it's tricky to get a grasp on when we're talking about it generally, though it tends to hold up in like lived experience. But really the constitutive model says we can't not communicate, which is a fundamental principle that our field operates off of. and that communication is ongoing and it's unfinished. And when we look at it that way, it's hard to jam the lived experience of communication just into like the metaphor model.
Yeah, just to chime in about the we cannot not communicate. That is something that is talked about in family systems theory as well, meaning that in a family, if someone is deemed as non-communicative or is failing to communicate, another way of looking at it, a more accurate way of looking at it, is that they're communicating by not communicating, right?
Yeah.
And more subtly, if we're just walking through the world, we're communicating all sorts of things. The way we're walking, the way we're dressed, our facial expression, the vibe we're giving off, these are all communications. Now, we might be miscommunicating. It also might be misunderstood by others, but there's just a constant stream of information that is being put out and received. You could have a blank face. You're communicating that you're blank.
Yeah, and I think it's easiest to kind of see like what the constitutive model, in my textbook I call it the uncommon sense model of communication or approach. It's easier to see it like when you talk about like advice that you would give. So the dominant model, which comes from communications, the transmission model of communication, clarity and concision are usually the top piece of advice that are given. So be clear in your communication, be concise. And of course, with like telegraphs and the bandwidth that early communications technology had, those would be so important for how messages are conveyed. But with the constitutive model, we don't hold those as the criteria of effective communication. And really, what an effective communication or good communication looks like depends entirely on the context, histories, cultural histories, relational histories, like all of it.
Right. Like if a white person walks through the mall, for example, with their head held high and with a bag of expensive clothes at their side, they're just not communicating that they just went shopping, whether they like it or know it or not. They are communicating the cultural context of privilege and wealth and all the baggage that comes with it. Again, whether they like it or not. Again, it could be miscommunicated, misunderstood. This level of communication needs to be understood.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that you just said made me think that, like, also in the constitutive model, meaning isn't fixed. So, like, what something means today, even the word communication, is going to be different and it changes over time. But meaning isn't located in the message itself. So, like, I can say to you with the intended message of, like, hey, how you're doing? Like, I'm intending to be having a greeting. But those words, I didn't decide what they meant. So I have some control, some agency, but there's all of these other histories that go along with what those words mean from me to you in this context. And so when we talk about like intentionality of communication, it's both intentional and unintentional. And I think that makes people uncomfortable. You know, we hear it frequently. Well, that's not what I meant. Why are you upset? That's not what I meant. And certainly it may not be what you meant, but no, it's still a meaning that's attached to it. And so we get really caught up in getting to determine meaning, when really meaning is negotiated and being negotiated and renegotiated all of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in family systems, we are very interested in conflict and misunderstanding in couples and families. This is a constant refrain in therapy and in life that you mentioned, that people are saying, why are you upset? Because you're misinterpreting what I said. I didn't say that. That wasn't my intent to put it out there. And the solution to that is, okay, fine, but let's get out of that rut, or at least let's move on to step 2, which is that things can be miscommunicated, things can be misunderstood. Also, when we're hot under the collar and distressed, we will communicate in ways that are unintended. You know, one of the classic examples to realize this is to record yourself. I've done this myself in conflict, and in the moment, I'll put $1 billion on the claim that what I said was measured and calm and logical, and then I listen back to it, and I'm like sharp and dickish and not even really saying what was in my head, This idea that somehow intent is the end of the road regarding the exploration leads to harm, as I think what you were mentioning in your email, that this is part of the myth or the misunderstanding of communication that can result in harm. Is that what you're concerned with?
Yeah. And I think, talk about yammering and meandering. Like yammering in the transmission model is like something you shouldn't do because it's like a waste of energy. In the constitutive model, yammering communication is all sense making. And so if I yammer on, it comes from an honest place. But
are you referring to like when I'm always saying that I'm yammering in my videos? Is that
kind of?
Yeah. Because I'm always like, okay, I'm yammering, or sorry for the yammering.
Because that's it exactly. And this is like this sneaky and I think harmful ways, if we're not aware about it, the way that we can discount certain types of communication like yammering or narrative or oral histories or things like that, oral ways of communicating. That's a really harmful thing because we could easily be like, that person isn't being clear, that person isn't being concise, when we hold these things as absolutely true. And then we miss out on a world, other people's worlds and different ways of engaging and knowing the world. And I think that's one way that it's really harmful, that we don't acknowledge that the way we talk about communication is so new. 1930s didn't really pick up until the 1950s, 60s, like so new, but we think and it feels true.
Is there a hypothesis as to why? I mean, obviously, wireless communication and that being trendy or more important in economics and politics and power, but is there an hypothesis about pre-1930s discourse or understanding of communication?
Oh, yeah. So there's a phenomenal book that's written, it's for like a popular press book by John Durham Peters, who is a communication scholar, called Speaking into the Air. And he really traces the idea of communication through history and the different types of communication and things like that. And so really the way that we talk about it came also from like a desire by communication folks to make the study of communication more scientific. So rhetoric and speech is where our discipline really started. And that's really more humanities. So like what my sister does arguably fits more with English, really is where our discipline started. And then 1950s, post-World War II, one way to talk about communication that would get funding for institutions to really validate it was to use these models of communications, which is the sender-receiver model. And so really that's one time that it becomes really popular. But there's also like lots of histories. We inherit these legacies from the Enlightenment assumptions. Descartes, I think, therefore I am, has had a tremendous impact on, like the way that we see the world, but also the way that we see communication is like between two individuals.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I think about communication prior to the 1900s, I think about my own ancestors being farmers in small towns with often large families and only coming into contact with only a few people. Even if they lived in town, they would only see a fraction of the humans or interact with, especially a fraction of the human beings that we see and communicate with today. And I wonder how different communication would be, because everyone you communicate with in all likelihood are people that you've been communicating with since you were born, again, whether you wanted to be communicating or not. So you don't have to start over every time with people. I mean, even people in our families. You can have a brother or a sister, maybe even a spouse if you're both working full-time and you are parenting together, but you don't turn to each other and communicate very often, at least explicitly. Then you have to start over and say, hello, how are you? Let's enter into a communication space. Whereas prior to the 1900s, 99% of people are farmers in these small little areas. And you don't have to start over and you don't have to take guesses as to what's being communicated or how things are being communicated. It'd be harder to deceive people, right? You would trust things more. And maybe there would be their own set of pitfalls, like just assuming that everyone understands what's in your head, or I don't know. But it seems like the very nature of the felt sense of communication would just be drastically different. And I'm guessing there's a lot of study in that area.
Oh, yeah. And so One thing that's been kind of a central area of my focus and research is looking at like the intimate family ideal, which also emerges, kind of almost around the same time as the transmission model of communication, and just what intimacy meant and what the exchange and how we talked about relationships. Like, we didn't use the word miscommunication. Like, that didn't exist as a concept prior to like the transmission model. And so just thinking and trying to put yourself in a place where, okay, you can't say that was a miscommunication. But one of the earliest kind of like definitions of communication we have comes from Latin, and it kind of boils down to partaking in interaction. And so you're communicating or you're communing, it's very similar etymological roots, when you're partaking. And what partaking is might be a silent, just eating food. It could just be being present. Also not being present, so not partaking, is also communicative as well. And so it's really interesting to think about how our lives would shift if we didn't talk about communication as though miscommunication, sender receive, noise also, right? Noise, there's noise, or, all of this kind of stuff. And like what understanding meant and everything like that. And so it's like really interesting to think about how that fundamentally changes the way that we interact with each other, decide what's good or bad communication and stuff like that.
What's an example of the pitfalls of that mindset?
So one pitfall is that we tend to see ourselves as creators of communication. So the individual has full agency. And then we really neglect how messages and meanings act on us, and they shape us. And so it's really uncomfortable in the individualistic society and culture that we occupy now to say that a message, whether it's in our awareness or out of our awareness, shapes our behavior, shapes our communication. And that's one area of my studies, is that when we get all of these messages about how a family should be, whether we consciously were like, those are garbage, I know that that's not true, it's still acting on us. So the communication, the message itself has agency to change us and shape us.
Right. Yeah. One could even say that our self, our personality, our essence, a large part of it is communication.
Yeah.
The communication that has been imparted on us and our interaction with that. What's another pitfall, like in a one-on-one conversation or at work or something?
So another pitfall is assuming that understanding is the baseline, and it's only when miscommunication happens that we're not understanding. And so the converse of that would be, or the opposite of that would be, we start from a place where we already assume we're not going to be at understanding. And so interactions, if we assume understanding, then we're surprised when it doesn't happen. So we're like, you didn't get what I was saying? Well, there must have been a miscommunication. And we blame like communication for not being able to coordinate. But really, communication, if we operate from the constitutive model, says we reach understanding temporarily, and then we might have to reach it again. And so maybe my boyfriend and I are having a conversation about like, I don't know, a conflict about where to go for Christmas or something like that. And we start off thinking we're already on the same page. And then it's kind of jostling when you figure out we're not on the same page or we're not on the same wavelength. Versus if we started with an approach where there's no reason to believe that anybody is on the same wavelength. Like we have some general rules that might hold true, but if we start from that place, understanding, it's a different process to reaching understanding.
Yeah, it can frame the experience if you bump up against misunderstanding that can make one feel unloved or that your relationship isn't good. Whereas what you're saying is that's a dubious assumption. Even if you are communicating a lot, that it's a dubious assumption that even understanding each other or being on the same page will last, right? The acknowledgement of that is made more easy when you understand the bigger picture of communication. So does that help you with your communication?
On a daily basis?
Yeah.
Oh, It does it. It does it. That transmission model, those cultural assumptions, they run deep. They run so deep. So I'll find myself in the middle of like a conflict, like destructive or constructive, and I could hear the voice in my head, and it's saying, "You know better than this. You know better than this. You know that this isn't how this works," and still, like, I have to push against this knowledge that feels true. And so, like, my reaction to things is still often operating from that transmission model. And so my sister and I will get in, we call them twin conflicts, but we'll get into an argument or something. And one of the things we say back and forth is, "You're operating from the transmission model." And like, that's like not insult, but that's like a kind of a comeback to be like, "You're doing something you know we both shouldn't be doing," or something like that. So it's hard. It's really, really hard.
It's funny. In my world, it's like if I'm having a conflict with Bob or another clinician, there'll be these kind of lingo insults like "you're triangulating," or or "that's not differentiated," or something, and it hits deep, but maybe slightly helpful at times. I wonder if people listening would think that it's a lonely prospect to accept this way of looking at the world, that we're rarely on the same page, even when we work at it. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we're on the same page, soon after we're on a different page. What would you say to that?
I would say that, along with that transmission model is this assumption, and I'm not the person that came up with this, I feel that a strong need to say there's many other communication scholars that wrote about this before me talking about it, of cognitivism, which is that we're locked inside our minds and that our thought processes, memories, cognitions all exist within the constraints of the human skull. And I would say that that's more or less true. I think that when in a hyper-individualistic society like our own, we run the risk of thinking we're locked inside of our minds and that nobody has contact, but really thought, memory, all of that is communicative as well. And it changes and it's not stable and it depends on all of the things around us. And so I would say that it would sound lonely, and I think it does kind of sound lonely if we think we're locked into our minds. But we create memories with other people. We ourselves are created through a series of messages. And so you were saying earlier, like, that communication, that, communicating is a big part of who we are. And as a communication scholar, a particular kind, I'd also like to caveat, I'm a particular kind. Half my field right now would disagree with some of what I'm saying. So that all we are layers of messages that we negotiate, layers of messages that we are aware of or unaware of. But that when we think about it that way, we're already really connected to people because we emerge out of relationships and messages with people. So it's less about,
Meaning that the self is a product of messages.
Yeah, the self is a product of messages. We have, myself included, new materialists, which would say that even non-human objects or animals, any non-human objects, also participate in communication with us. And so a birth certificate is participating in communication with us, and it's stabilizing a relationship that we have with our parents or our caregivers. And even if we want to be estranged from them, so we want to cease interactions with them, that birth certificate still exists. And so it becomes a part of communicating and who we are and how we relate to people.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this, but when I've heard experts speak about this concept of the self not being contained within the skull, the way that I think about it is that it's not like this supernatural, magical energy thing, which it can be confused for. It's more of a recognition that we have never, as creatures, as organisms, existed in isolation. And when you do isolate us, very strange things start to happen to us. We start to lose the self. We start to hallucinate things in our world so that we can interact with them. The conclusion is that our self and our grasp of reality depends on us existing within a 3D, emotional, physical space, communicative space. You say our memories are, people say our memories are contained in the body, and you're saying memories are contained within our social relationships or our 3D world, like the birth certificate, right? That's a part of our self. If you erased that or changed it, the self would feel different, right? You have a DNA result that tells you who you are, what your ancestry is, and that can mean something, and all the interactions with culture and your understanding of history and time and space. So are there people in your field, is that what they would disagree with? Is that the self is defined by layers of communication?
Layers of communication. They would also probably disagree and have disagreed with the proposition that non-human objects are important and have a constitutive or a constructive function in communication. And so really, like that sender-receiver model really isolates what gets to count as communication as between two individuals. But then all of the things outside of those two individuals, all of those messages and interactions kind of get bled from it. And so it's easy to generalize communication between two individuals, but out of context. But when we start to think about a larger, more holistic picture, it becomes a lot more problematic. And that's one of the things I think is like a big takeaway, I hope, from this conversation, is that the rigid way that we think about communication constrains the options that we have available to us in any given interaction. If I'm preoccupied with being clear and concise, then I'm not paying attention to all of these other things in an interaction, like what the other person's response is, or adjusting my message to my audience. I'm not paying attention to those things because I'm so preoccupied with clarity and concision.
Interesting. Like if you're in a conflict with your partner, if you're primarily or solely focused on making sure that you're saying something or communicating in a way that feels accurate and concise and clear to yourself, then you will ignore the 99% of other things that would be helpful to pay attention to. In a conflict, someone is about to enter into a tense conversation. They know that it's going to be potentially conflictual with their partner, and they've been indoctrinated into the transactional model of communication, so they're thinking about conciseness and clearness. What reminders could they give themselves?
Well, one, I would say a flag that you're getting into that area is when you start dealing in absolutes, or you're like, you're just not paying attention to me. You don't understand what I'm saying, or just like kind of like critiquing in that way. But I think something that people could pay attention to that gets outside of that is like background, like understanding why you have this belief. And it's in that understanding that you have this belief or you're coming from this conflict that's really important that the other person knows. And because it feels true to us, we sometimes don't interrogate where it's coming from. And I mean, I'm like, this isn't news to like psychologists, right? Because the way that we experience communication is way more consistent than that with how we're talking about it than the way that it's conceptualized with this model. But I'll give you an example just from last night. I'm sure he'll appreciate this. My partner and I got into a conflict, a constructive conflict. It was a really constructive conflict about something to do with the holidays. And I just remember thinking, I'm like, he's not understanding, but I don't know what he's not understanding. He's like, I don't understand why this is upsetting to you. And then I really had to think, I'm like, wait, why is this upsetting to me? Because there's nothing inherently wrong with the topic itself, but it comes from my history of interactions from my childhood, right? And those braid into who we are. And so I had to be like, hold on a goddamn second. And so I had to think about, I didn't say that to him, but I was like, I need a second. So I had to think about it. And I'm like, this is the part that you're missing, that when I was growing up, my mom got married a few times, and so I had to constantly be going into families. And I don't like feeling like I have to conform or I have to be somebody who I'm not. So it's really hard for me when I go into your family, and now I don't want to do to myself the same thing that was done to me when I was a kid. And so like acknowledging that nothing comes from nowhere, that's one of my favorite sayings. Nothing comes from nowhere with communication, messages, who we are. Interrogating what are the previous interactions, what's the previous communication that has set me up to be where I am now. And that's tricky though, because if he wasn't a good partner, he could be like, yeah, that's just in your head. Of course, that's not what he said. Not of course, I shouldn't say that, but he was like, oh, that makes sense now. You make sense. This whole interaction makes sense now. And so I think that's the part that gets missed in the transmission model of communication. It took me time to figure out what that was, to make sense of why this was upsetting to begin with. But then I was like, oh no, I got it.
That's great. And one could say that your end result communication is more clear and is more concise or is more accurate, right? Mm-hmm. The first level of communication of, stubbornness or resistance to, I'm guessing, going to his family for the holidays was not the accurate communication, wasn't the accurate message. The, quote unquote, accurate message is what really was going on for you deep down, right? Which you'll hear me talk about from my perspective, or, the model that I adhere to in my field regarding schemas and trauma and relational aspects and defenses and, unconscious drives. And for us to understand that, one of the things that I will frequently talk about is that I believe, and this isn't super unique to me, but that all relational conflict, or 99% of it, comes from feeling hurt or afraid. And often we're just afraid of being hurt. Mm-hmm. So really it's pain. It's relational pain. It's being rejected. It's being left alone. It's being abandoned, feeling discarded, thrown aside, disrespected. So we are afraid a lot and we're hurt a lot. We're afraid of being hurt a lot. From that, we have all these messages, I suppose you could say, in your model of what informs that, right? For you, you don't have to respond to this if you don't want to, but, the history that you have regarding the random new family members, quote unquote, step people that you would have to interact with. And after the, second or third marriage of your mom, you're thinking, well, how long is this going to last? And, because every family has its pros and its cons, right? Like in my family, since we don't have that instability, the problems in my family, I can say, well, it's worth it to overlook it or to work on it or to give people the benefit of the doubt, because I'm going to be with these people for the rest of my life, and I have been my whole life, and they've been there for me, and I'll be there for them, and it's all worth it. Whereas, for you in that context, it's like, well, why am I putting all this effort, especially when you're young and you just don't cognitively value that kind of family connection necessarily, and you're having all these messages of maybe judgment on you or criticism on you or rejection on you, feeling hurt, alienated. And so those are all the messages that are layered upon layer, right? And as your partner says, let's hang out with my family or my in-laws from this other side or whatever, that you're coming to the table with all of those internalized messages, but what you're communicating is something like, well, I don't understand why we always have to go to your family, or I don't understand why you're so interested in hanging out with your family. I mean, I don't know what sort of point you were bringing up, but the service level communication doesn't represent the communication of the messages, I guess, is me trying to conform to your model and your lingo, I suppose. Yeah.
And I think like the value of looking at it in terms of messages and meanings is that it's not a dysfunction with me. That I make sense when you look at the context and you look at the messages. And so it's easier to be like, this is the logic that I run from or that I operate from or a schema that I operate from. But the value of looking at it as messages is that it's not my fault. Like I'm responsible for it and I'm responsible for how I bring it in and how I negotiate it. But I make sense. And I think that is a huge part because often you're like, you don't make sense, you're being illogical. And when I hear that, what I think now is I'm like, I don't understand yet why this makes sense to them. Like, it's not that they're illogical, it's that their logic is still ambiguous to me. And that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so interesting for me to talk with people from other disciplines and discover that we're all looking at the same thing. We're all recognizing the same phenomenon, but we're framing it within our theoretical or our disciplinary lingo. Like when I talk with neuro people, they'll talk in terms of executive function and limbic system and other kind of perceptual systems of the body and the mind. The ones that I agree with anyway, and more and more so as time goes on, they will land in a place of attachment and schemas and history and relational traumas and attachment needs, relational needs. But the way that they describe it is through the neurological lingo. In my discipline, it's of psychology and family systems and psychodynamic theory and cognitive theory. It has all that language, but it's the same thing. It's that our needs are there. So do you recognize that communication happens within us, that we have, say, a need that's being communicated, like thirst or attachment, and the self recognizes that communication? Do you speak in that language?
Yeah, I would feel comfortable with that language. We call it intrapersonal communication, and so like how we're communicating with ourselves. I think that for me, the important part of communication or my or orientation to it is that nothing's taken for granted. Everything has to come from somewhere. And so if I'm talking about it in terms of needs, which I most often do, especially in my classes, I still am really curious. I'm like, okay, where did that idea come from? What's the baggage that comes along with needs or attachment or something like that? And so for me, that makes total sense. But I'm also in the back of my mind, keeping in mind, I'm like, don't accept this as big T truth. Truth, from my perspective, is more or less stable. There's some truths that are more stable and some truths that are less stable. And it's the truths that feel really stable that I really dig into. So the truth that an intimate family is the ideal, like that is what you should do. And then that's where my estrangement research came from. Like talking to people who would consider estrangement ideal for them, but really struggle against that ultimate, like that big T truth that you should be intimate with your family members. And then it gets brought up again because people will say, well, you only get one parent. You only get one mom or dad. And I had a participant in one of my studies say, yeah, and they sucked. Like, yeah, and I wish they were different. This is the best relationship that I can have with them. And so for me, it's always keeping in mind that those truths are not fixed. And I always want to be thinking about what's the baggage that comes with a truth or a perspective. That was truly meandering from the actual question you asked, and I'm so sorry.
No, I like it. We're meandering through the topics. This is the next thing I wanted to talk with you about. Yeah, I don't know if you've listened to my audio podcast, but I will often...
All the time.
Oh, okay.
All the time, yeah.
So I did a recent episode about family estrangement with Christy. Did you listen to that episode?
I haven't gotten to that. I'm going back and forth between the reaction videos and then going back to the Patreon podcast. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, I interviewed a friend of mine who had I'm really curious to hear what you think about this episode, because Christy talks about being estranged from her father for many years and having recently reconnected with him. Mm-hmm. And I'll get questions from people along these lines of, is it okay to cut yourself off from your parents, right? And if you just ask the general public, you'll get this, ridiculous notion that you were talking about earlier, that, you only, quote unquote, you only get one parent, or what kind of deplorable daughter or son just completely rejects their parents. There's always a way to recover, or you have to take the good with the bad, or your parents gave you so much, you owe it to them or something. And this is, I'm just guessing, a puritanical notion of religion or of tradition or of the power structure, which is mostly older people with kids who might be pissed off at them. And it's a ridiculous notion. We have a pull, which can be good and bad, to repair and be connected with our family members. But at the end of the day, up to us to figure out what's the healthiest life moving forward. And most of the time, I'm thinking that with my clients, they're holding on way longer than what would be healthy for them because of this notion that I think just comes from within a little bit of just this desire to connect and have a good relationship with the people that raised us, right? But also from the outside in terms of culture. So what led you to the topic of family estrangement and also researching this? Because you've published studies on, you call it functional family estrangement. I'm guessing that means like, estranging yourself from family in a functional, healthy way.
Yeah. So, it came from like a really kind of natural place. So I'm estranged from my father, and I have been for a very long time. And we were talking about it in a seminar, and that was the first time I'm like, oh, I'm estranged from my dad. Like, I hadn't realized it. Like, that wasn't a word that I put to it. And then as soon as I put the word to it, I'm like, oh God, that comes with like so much, like we're a broken family or something like that. And really, it's just kind of the way that our relationship like relaxed into itself, really, like as I became an adult. But that made me wonder, I'm like, how do other people understand estrangement? And so my first study was kind of like a two-part. So like the first part I did with a friend who lives in Seattle now. But she graduated from UW with her undergrad. But we looked at what a happy family was, or what a healthy family was. That was a healthy family. And healthy family, the way that it's talked about in the literature, we analyzed literature, we analyzed like studies and approaches and things like that, is that you're in constant communication, that you have intimacy with your core family members, your nuclear family, and that it has little to no conflict. And that's like in the literature. And so the opposite of that is estrangement. And so by not communicating, by potentially having conflict, you're automatically put into this dysfunctional category of it. And it's not like there's one person being like, you're dysfunctional. It's all of the meaning that comes with that word. And so then while we were doing that, I did interviews with people who are like, yeah, I'm estranged. And I didn't define it for them. I didn't say like, here's the definition of estrangement. Do you fit it? I just said, hey, do you consider yourself estranged? I want to know why. And so that's where the functional estrangement started from, which is really that I'm estranged and I'm healthy. Like, this is healthy for me. Like, defying the functional, dysfunctional binary of healthy families. No, I don't communicate. Maybe the estrangement was because of conflict, or maybe it wasn't, but I'm healthy nonetheless. And it was really this push. There was one interview in particular where one of the participants was saying, she's like, I'm a family, she was finishing her PhD in family therapy. And she's like, when I go to people and they hear that I'm estranged, now all of a sudden my credibility is called into question. Now all of a sudden, like, partners are like, well, why are you estranged? Like, what's wrong with you? And that like all of this was happening. And she's like, but I'm not broken. I'm estranged, but I'm not broken. And so really that kind of like started my curiosity with how do we construct what the healthy family is? And then what is inevitably, like, what's the harm that comes from a really rigid definition of a healthy family? Because I would say my estrangement from my father is healthy. Mm-hmm. And she would have said the same. And then like what happens when we have like family day at colleges or parents' day and you're estranged from your parents? For one of my participants, she tried to reconcile because of all of these messages she'd been getting about the importance of parents and the importance of family. She tried to reconcile with her parents, and it ended really like traumatically for her again. And so like all of these decisions we make about interactions are guided by all of this meaning that's acting on us. And yeah, I mean, that was a long answer too. That's where it came from.
No, it's all fleshing it out. Yeah. Are there some kids who, as teens or adults, are unreasonably rejecting their parents and or their family of origin? Uh-huh. The answer is yes. But generally speaking, and this is just anecdotal, that when I talk with an adult who has an urge or who has estranged and cut themselves off from their parents, 99% of the time or 95% of the time, I will conclude that that individual resisted doing that far too long.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And is doing it because it is absolutely justified. Because our drive is to try to make it work, and our forgiveness of our caregivers is sometimes misplaced. You'll have a 10-year-old that will be loyal to their parents even if their parents are being abusive, right? We understand that children will be that way, and that doesn't go away when we're 25 or 35. And so if someone is coming to me and saying that they're estranged, I assume that it was absolutely justified because of all the cultural and internal pressures against that, right? So emotionally, did it feel gratifying to establish that research area and to talk with other people who had estranged themselves from their families?
Yeah, I think it did. I think that the part that felt gratifying was that I'm like, okay, so this idea of estrangement being bad, it came from a place, and it's more or less true. Like it's flexible. Like it's more flexible than I had originally anticipated. And then for my dissertation, I interviewed people who considered themselves functionally estranged. And what I noticed was, and this was one chapter, that there's like, they kind of fit into 3 loose categories. One, which was the most prevalent, was like estrangement as the last resort. Only they tried everything, and it was only after all of this pain that they came to the conclusion that they had to be estranged. Then there was people who viewed it as like normative, like estrangement is a way that relationships are. It's common, and it's just how I interact. And then there was one subset that was like, estrangement is ideal. And I had one participant say, if I could prescribe estrangement to people, I would. And so just like these flexible ways of knowing, I think is a real gift, because we get locked into the idea that estrangement is bad and I have to feel bad about myself. But the beauty of communication is that we can negotiate, and doesn't happen in a moment, but like we can have agency in the way that we think about things or the messages about things. But we have to know that it's not 100% true, that those truths don't come from nowhere. They come from a specific history and a specific culture. And so I think it was valid, but there was also times where I would find myself interviewing participants and they would say something that was like kind of contradicting an idea that I had. And I had to be so careful because I'm like, well, this is my experience of it, and I need to understand their experience of it. Estrangement itself, when we put it like in an individualistic culture like our own, it starts to make more sense, right? So it's a resource. It's like, as an individual, I have these needs. Like, this is what I can do. But I have a friend who's from China, and we were talking about it, and strangely, we deal with some of the very similar problems with our parents. And I said to her, I'm like, well, would you ever consider estrangement? And she's like, that's not an option. That like in my culture, in my family, so it's not only like broad culture that we're born into, but our family culture. She's like, if I tried to, they'd fly here and show up at my door. Like, that's not an option. And so like estrangement or cutoff is also really tied to Western individualistic like cultural history. And that doesn't mean other people don't, or other cultures don't have access to it, but it's something that's constantly brought up in my mind. So like as we kind of move further, we'll just use the United States. In the United States, like who we get to have intimate relationships with has shrunk. So from the time of the community days when we might be farmers, we could have more relatives that are close by. We have more people. But then, 1950s roll around, industrialization before, obviously. The family unit starts to shrink, and it shrinks legally. Who gets to count as family? And who we get to be intimate with. And so it's like, we're supposed to be most intimate with our romantic partners and our kids, but then our kids are supposed to go off, et cetera, et cetera. And this individualism really guides how we think who we should be connected with. And then also, cost benefit, like weighing the costs and benefits of relationships comes about from, economics. That's an economic metaphor. And it only really exists when we isolate individuals down to individual needs. And then my question is always like, well, how do we talk about those needs, and where does the way that we talk about needs come from? And not that it's good or bad. It's both enabling and constraining. But yeah, that's what you just said made me think of.
Yeah, the whole concept of internal needs is socially constructed and influenced by time and place and culture and the nature of the self, how it's conceptualized. Well, let me just ask you, are there other bullet points that you wanted to get into today that I haven't asked you about?
I think the only other bullet point that I wanted to bring up, and it kind of connects something that you said far back in our meanderings, which is that it feels like, this idea of constitutive communication is kind of lonely, that when we look at communication as flexible, there's so much power and freedom that comes from it, because the way that things are isn't the way that they have to be. And the way that we change them is by changing the way that we communicate in communication. And so there's nothing about the world that we engage with that it has to be that way. It's not fixed. It's in constant flux. And so when we engage with communication as also flexible, like, we can change things. Like, we can change things in our relationships. We can change how we view ourselves through, like, talk therapy or therapy, like all of that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of freedom, I think, that comes from a different perspective of communication. That's the only other bullet point I had.
If I merge my lingo with yours, therapy is a set of messages and communications that become internalized and circumvent or replace the foundational communications and messages that make up the self or guide the self or see the self, see others. Like, if you grew up with a lot of untrustworthy individuals, and your therapist counteracts that by being a very trustworthy person, there is a number of messages that are being communicated that someone means what they say, that someone can be trusted, that you as a client deserve to have someone consider your trust in them to be important. And this is repeated over and over again, subtly and not so subtly in therapy, such that the self, after a course of therapy, leaves therapy and is operating on a different set of messages to guide the self and behavior and their expectations of the world. Is that your language or my language, or a merging of
I think it's a good merging. I mean, like, I'm constantly merging your language with my language when I listen to your podcast. And that is how, that's pretty consistent with the conversations I've had with you in my head.
Okay.
But like, it's when we view the self as contained in our bodies and as present, we like forget that we didn't come to be who we are by ourselves. We came through all these interactions. So if we want to be different, we have to have different interactions. We have to have new messages, and we have to like process and like let them interweave into our lives. And so surrounding yourself with messages that reflect the way that you want to view the world, or that reflects like healthier, whatever that means, like healthier communication, is really important. So something I noticed when I listened to your podcast, and it's not conscious, it's very much outside of my awareness, is that the way that you talk about relationships and things like that, it like gets in my head. And now all of a sudden I'm talking to myself and to others in different ways. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind that communication isn't also just this conscious thing. Like, you're not consciously aware of how messages are impacting you. So be cautious about the messages that you're exposing yourself to, and be cautious about how you're engaging with those messages, because it could be healthy and beneficial, like I like to think when I listen to your podcast, or it could be, really damaging. So like the dark side, red pill side of the internet, right? It can be really, really damaging and yeah.
Yeah. With all the messages and communication, the communication age that we're living through.
Yeah.
And with Twitter and Reddit and YouTube, it's a scary prospect. We see the results of this, right? And by the way, is that like you have a constituency in your mind of all the messages that are happening? Where does the word constituent come from?
Constitutive, so it's similar to construction, but with construction, there's an assumption there's like an individual constructing. So constitutive it's not even necessarily in your person, necessarily. It's like in you and around you. And
the collective construction.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you one more question, which is, when you watch Sister Wives, what sort of communication concepts come to mind?
Oh boy! So when I watch Sister Wives, or I've watched
and don't spoil past season 8, because I'm on season 8 right now.
I won't. But when I watched that, or I watched the Secret Lives of Mormon Housewives, and I teach in Provo. My sister, we got very lucky. She got a job at Utah State University in Logan, which is like 2 hours away. Which is like, I don't know how that happened, but like when I'm looking at it, what I see is these individuals like negotiating their relationship within a larger like religious context that constrains them from being able to do what it seems like they want to do or like articulate what they want to do. From an outsider's perspective, because I'm from Montana originally, and then I got my PhD in Nebraska. But from an outsider's perspective, you can just see kind of like the tendrils of the religious ideology, like shaping the interactions and then shaping like a lot of distress and unhappiness. And sometimes it's kind of hard to watch because I know that I have students that are going through something very similar, and my men students, but my women students as well. So they marry very young, and oftentimes get divorced very young, and getting divorced is really frowned upon. And, you know, Utah has one of the highest rates of domestic abuse in the United States. And I think it would be silly to say that this idea that you have to make it work because this is where you're going to go in heaven with these individuals, like you have to put the work in. It's like so discouraged. And so for me, it's like all of these messages, I can see the effects of them, and I can see it's like almost physically, like visually, I can see how they're shaping the interactions. Sometimes I would never say like it's always bad. I think sometimes it can be good. There's like a communal essence of some of the messages that are very touching, but then it can be very, very difficult. And in my experience, I've seen that with my students too, that it can be very, very difficult and constraining. They think they're bad, or they think they have to stay in a relationship because it was sealed in the church or something like that. And so I see them struggle all of the time with this ideology. So it's painful. It can be hard to watch sometimes. Like it makes me really, really sad for my students sometimes.
Yeah. That's a central question that I've had from the beginning of watching Sister Wives, which is when Christine, for example, one of the Sister Wives, will say something that seems to indicate that she likes the marriage and likes the situation overall. I wonder, well, what assumptions is she basing that on? Is she truly free to even explore the downside or her own needs? You know, when a woman who is raised in a highly patriarchal society has a need like wanting respect or freedom or fun, creativity, a hobby away from family and domestic activities, do they even allow themselves to have those feelings? So Dr. Jordan Allen, thank you for coming on the podcast. If people wanted to reach out to you, how can they do so?
Yeah, so I'm working on a podcast of my own, very much inspired by you and the terrible communication advice that's like kind of handed out. Like, I know we agree on this, like that you can detect deception by nonverbal cues. Myths like that, you know? So you can follow that as it kind of like emerges, and like the textbook, which will be open to everybody and not written like a traditional kind of like boring to school textbook. So even if you're not in college, you could read it and hopefully get something of it at the Communication Crackdown. Communication Crackdown, one word.
That's the podcast?
That's and all of the social media. Yeah.
Okay. So your podcast and your website that houses all of your links to your books and all your other work is what's it called again?
Communication Crackdown.
CommunicationCrackdown.com.
There is no website yet. So you'll have to, yeah. So Instagram is the best. The TikToks is the best.
Okay. So Communication Crackdown on TikTok and on Instagram.
Yeah,
and
for right now.
Eventually you'll have your own audio podcast or YouTube channel or something?
Yeah, in YouTube channel. And so we have a couple of episodes. This business is hard. Like figuring out podcasting is exceptionally difficult. Yeah. Like the sound and so we're a work in progress, but we're there.
You and your sister?
No, so it was me and my colleague from my university. And so we just were like, I can't believe people are saying this. And then I'm like, hey, there's this psychologist that is kind of like complicating and dispelling like myths about relationships and stuff. Like we could do something pertaining to communication kind of similar.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. Countering all the body language nonsense.
Oh my God. I'm writing my nonverbal chapter right this second. And so I'm like really deep in that research, and I'm like, oh God, it's just not good. But people think about, it's woven into those cultural assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'll have those videos suggested to me on YouTube, and it's depressing how many views they have.
Well, yeah. And they make so much money. So
Yeah.
why, like that's the other thing. I'm like, it's not that this idea isn't like profiting somebody.
Right. And, I've watched I've only watched a handful over the years, and I will say that there are some that are careful about the claims. They'll call themselves like body language experts or whatever, but when they're actually talking, they're way more tentative and basing their statements on research. So maybe it's a way to educate people about the actual science. But then there are other YouTube channels where they're not clinicians or scientists, and they claim to be experts on body language, and they'll say like, oh, well, when you're crossing your legs, it means you're lying or whatever. And just nonsense like that. Yeah. And sometimes I feel bad because I feel like I frustrate a lot of people when I'm watching, because I will 95% of the time, at least I think, maybe even more, I will say, I have no idea how to interpret what I'm watching right now. Because they know they're on camera and the editors are involved. So I think this is what's happening, but I can't really tell. God knows what's happening behind the scenes. I'm going to assume that it's a vastly more nuanced, maybe even just completely opposite story than what is seemingly being communicated to us now. I just can't help but to be that way. And I think that it turns a lot of people off. Because when I'm watching Sister Wives, I get the impression that people would love it if I just yelled at Cody the whole time and called him a narcissist, But I just can't get myself to do it, regardless of how much money I might be able to make from it.
Oh, you would probably be able to make a lot. Yeah. I mean, I generally steer clear of people who deal in absolutes. Like that's something that came with age too, and just like, getting more familiar with the world. But I'm like, if I hear you talking in absolutes, then even if I agree with the absolutes, and usually especially if I agree with your absolutes, I'm like, there's something else here. Like that's not the world. That's not a way to engage with. That's a good way to engage with the world.
So if people want to find you, it's Communication Crackdown on Instagram and on TikTok.
Yeah, that would be the easiest.
And eventually you'll be starting a podcast with a colleague, an audio podcast on iTunes and and a YouTube channel on
Just
YouTube.
as soon as I figure out what an RSS feed is. Yeah. And so once I master that, we're going to be good to go.
Okay. Well, maybe after we conclude, I'll give you some tips if you're interested. But thanks for coming on the podcast, Dr. Jordan Allen. We've only gotten on the tip of the iceberg in terms of your knowledge base. You've provoked a lot of germinating questions in my mind, because it's a paradigm shift what you're proposing. Yeah. So thanks for coming on the podcast, Dr. Jordan Allen. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself. Why should people take care of themselves, Jordan?
Because they deserve it. They really, really do.